The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, thank you for joining us for this Repower PVD session, Effective Design Strategies for Optimal Energy Performance and Occupant Comfort and Health. I'm Connie Empress, Communications Manager at New Buildings Institute. Before we begin, I have a couple of housekeeping things to tell you about. First, you are muted and we cannot hear you. This helps keep the background noise down so that everyone can better hear the speakers. I want to direct you to the dashboard that you should be able to see on the right-hand side of your screen. If you are having technical difficulties and cannot see the slides or hear our speakers, you can use the question pane in this dashboard to let us know, and we will help you as we go. Please ask questions in the same question pane as they come up. We will take some questions between speakers and then again at the end of the presentation. At the end of the webinar session, you will be given the opportunity to take a short survey. You will receive a follow-up email by the end of this week with links to the recording and slides for this session. This webinar is being recorded. I'd like to introduce Dilip Shah. He is the Building Energy Advisor for the Office of Sustainability for the City of Providence, Rhode Island. He will be discussing Repower PVD and the role of benchmarking in Providence. I'll pass it over to you, Dilip.
Thank you, Connie. Hello, everyone. As Connie mentioned, I'm Dilip Shah, Building Energy Advisor at the City of Providence. I'm involved in the development and implementation of policies and programs that will help reduce energy consumption in our large buildings and help us become carbon neutral by 2050. Buildings are responsible for 70% of our carbon dioxide emissions. That's why we are focusing on our large buildings. The city has been leading by example. What I meant by that is we have been benchmarking our own buildings since 2010, and as of 2016, we have been publishing the data on our website. One of the programs that I'm leading is our voluntary challenge program called Repower PVD. As part of our commitment to our current and future participants, we are offering this webinar in partnership with New Buildings Institute. Having said that, on behalf of the Office of Sustainability, I welcome you all to this webinar. First, I will give you a brief overview of the program. Then I will tell you a little bit about the energy benchmarking policy that we have been working on, and then answer any questions you may have. As you can see from this slide, our Mayor Jorge Lorza officially launched Repower PVD on April 30th of this year. There are 5 very enthusiastic partners who have committed to work with us on this program. They are the Northeast Energy Efficiency Partnerships, the Rhode Island Office of Energy Resources, National Grid, New Buildings Institute, and last but not least, the US EPA. Our challenge program has 2 tracks. The first is called 20% reduction by 2025. Using a 2015 as baseline, property owners may enter any buildings over 10,000 square feet by committing to reduce energy consumption by 20%. The second track is called Race to Zero. Property owners may also enter their buildings into the race to become the first zero energy building in Providence. For the purpose of this program, a ZEB is a building which produces as much energy as it consumes over the course of a year. Typically, this is achieved via an ultra-low energy building that has on-site renewable energy which equals or outproduces the building energy consumption, so that the net annual energy consumption is less than or equal to 0. Next slide, please. So far, 6 property owners, including the city, has joined the Energy Reduction Challenge, and a total of approximately 2.3 million square feet of real estate is enrolled. Starting from the upper left and going clockwise, the buildings enrolled are Regency Plaza. These are the luxury apartment buildings. Next is IGT Center, formerly known as GTech Center, which is office building. Then you can see Marriott Hotel, downtown Providence. And the last one is Providence Housing Authority's building called Kilmartin Plaza. This is a 106 unit affordable housing community. Next slide, please. Another participant is a property owners and operator called Cornish Associates. They have enrolled 7 buildings for a total of more than 395,000 square feet. This slide shows 4 of their buildings. All of these buildings are apartment buildings, and they are located in downtown Providence. Next slide, please. The city of Providence has enrolled 10 buildings for a total of more than 992,000 square feet. And 4 of those buildings are shown in this slide. Again, starting from upper left and going clockwise, these buildings are Mount Pleasant High School, Nathan Bishop Middle School, Joseph Dudley Jr. building. This is office building. And then you have Mary Fogarty Elementary School. Next slide, please. So far, there are 2 participants who have entered the Race to Zero track of the challenge. One of them is Jonathan Knowles, professor at RISD, and the second is Truth Boxing, whose founder is Peter Case. Next slide, please. Here is my contact information as well as web address for the program, where you can learn more about the program and available resources. I know that there are a number of people from energy services companies who are on this call. So I just want to tell this to them, that if you are working with any property owners in Providence, please encourage them to take advantage of this opportunity and participate in the program. I also wanted to take this opportunity to share with all of you that last year we worked with various stakeholders and co-created a draft ordinance called Building Energy Reporting Ordinance, otherwise known as BERO. We plan to introduce this ordinance in the first quarter of next year. If it is approved, it will require all owners of buildings that are equal to or greater than 10,000 square feet to benchmark their energy and water use, and to benchmark energy and water use using EPA's Energy Star Portfolio Manager tool, and then submit that data to the city of Providence. And after that, the city will publish all of that information on its website. Needless to say, it will transform the market and open up many opportunities for various stakeholders, including but not limited to the owners and operators of the buildings, the energy service providers, and our utility company, National Grid. So this Repower PVD program provides an excellent platform for large property owners to become familiar with the EPS Portfolio Manager, benchmark their energy usage, and be ready to comply with our ordinance. With that, if there are any questions, I will answer them prior to handing this over to Sean.
Dilip, there are no questions at this time.
Okay, thank you, Connie. Then, I'm just handing this over to Sean and you.
Sean?
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now, Sean.
There we go. It wouldn't be a webinar without at least one technical difficulty. Hello, everyone. My name is Sean Dennison. I'm a senior project manager at New Buildings Institute. And with that great introduction to activities that are going on in Providence specifically, we're going to move into more general talking about zero energy and effective design strategies for optimal energy performance and occupant comfort and health in buildings. Now, Since this is qualifying for AIA learning credits, we do have our learning objectives here for you to review. I'm sure you looked at them if you signed up for this program, but we want to start with a brief introduction to the New Buildings Institute. We are a nonprofit that work to make buildings more efficient. We work to shape the future with innovation, research, design guidance, and advanced building energy policy. We specialize in zero energy, best practices in new and existing buildings, and continuous codes and policy innovation. We are really a mission-driven organization, and we love to partner with cities like Providence who are looking to the future. So let's start with just a brief discussion of what is zero energy. You heard Dilip talk about how they're considering zero energy in Providence, and if you're looking beyond that, you can see that it can get a little bit confusing. There's a lot of terms out there. Zero carbon buildings, zero electric buildings, near zero energy buildings, zero net ready buildings, zero energy buildings, zero energy, a whole lot of terms out there. And in fact, you know, to help try to bring some clarity to this, the Department of Energy in 2015 actually released a definition of what a zero energy building, what they consider a zero energy building. It's an energy efficient building, or you could consider a campus, community, or portfolio that produces at least as much energy as it uses in a year. When grid supplied energy is accounted for at the source, including primary energy for generation, transmission, and delivery to the site. So I wanted to point one thing out here, and that's this definition is talking about source energy. And that's one of the big questions anytime that you're talking about zero energy is how do you count that energy? Is it source? Is it site? Is it time-dependent valuation? So let's look at two of those specifically, because I think this is important to understand. So site energy is the total energy used on site. Whatever form it arrives to the site, that's what gets measured. So it's translated to kBTU per square foot, but that's the therms of natural gas that come in. That's the kilowatt hours that come into the site. Source is a little bit different. So source takes into account what it took to produce that energy. So in the case of natural gas, well, it was extracted largely how it is. So that calculation, site and source is very similar. But when it comes to electricity, what it took to produce that electricity can vary tremendously from one part of the country to another, depending on whether it was produced from hydro or coal or natural gas or renewable sources like solar and wind. And so this is an important consideration for when you are looking at zero energy, is how you are actually counting that energy. But I think it's useful to think of zero energy in just a more basic and general terms. And that's that a zero energy building is an ultra efficient building that generates as much energy as it consumes on a net annual basis. A simple way to think about it. And you can get into the specifics when you're actually trying to reach a goal for someone else. So if you want to reach the goals in Providence, you heard how they were defining that. A simple site zero energy requirement. But if you're seeking zero energy from a different certification like living building or somewhere else, it's important to pay attention to how they're actually defining zero energy. So with that basic understanding, I think it's a good idea for us to look at the growth of zero energy, because zero energy has moved from being just the bleeding edge of technology and building construction to really it's approaching almost a new normal. It's in the mainstream now. It's very achievable. It's achievable with off-the-shelf components, and we can see the growth just since 2012. NBI has a report that we put out on the Getting to Zero status report, and we've been putting it out about every 2 years, and you can see the growth and what we have found around the country. We're seeing zero energy buildings in every part of the country. There's just a couple of states that don't have them all, but it's important to notice that this is not something that's just geographically limited to a few places, and especially not limited to only a few climate zones. We see that we have zero energy buildings in all of the climate zones in the continental United States. Even climate zone 7 are, our most extreme cold, and climate zone 1 are most extreme hot climates. So we have examples of zero energy buildings being achieved in every climate in the country. And not only that, we're seeing it happen under every kind of ownership type. The very beginning, we saw zero energy buildings were kind of limited to owner-occupied buildings where all of those details of how you do building construction and operation are simpler. But now we're seeing that zero energy is being achieved in all kinds of buildings. Of course, private for profit is still the biggest sector, but public buildings, whether that's county, city, or state, or federal, but we're also seeing private nonprofit and private multifamily. There was a time when a lot of people thought that multifamily was not going to be a building type that we could get to zero energy, but it's actually one of the fastest growing building types today. And we're seeing it in lots of different sizes of buildings. So on the left here, you can see what we're calling the zero energy verified. These are buildings that have been operating. We've seen their bills and we know that they have actually achieved zero energy. The zero energy emerging on the right side, since zero energy is an actual performance basis, these are the ones that were designed to be zero energy, but we're still waiting on that actual performance data to verify that they are. But when you look at that, you can see that we are seeing zero energy buildings in lots of different building sizes. Now, there's a little bit of a concentration in that 50K to 100K, but zero energy really is possible in any building type and any building size. Now, when you're thinking about that consumption side of zero energy, because we have to remember zero energy is where you balance consumption with on-site renewable production. So you have to bring down that consumption first. And if we're going to compare the typical consumption of a zero energy building, because remember, we've looked at a whole lot of them in our Getting to Zero status report, what we're seeing is that it still requires a pretty big reduction from where the codes are. The codes really aren't close to the level of performance that you need for zero energy. And to a certain extent, that really makes sense. If you think about it, the code defines the worst building that you can legally make. So zero energy is really a higher standard of building our buildings. So a 67% reduction just in this example for office in this case, if you look at this chart, it's not from codes, it's actually from the average performance of an office building from CBEX, the Commercial Building Energy Consumption Survey from the EPA. So we're seeing, a real performance premium over kind of your typical average building. And what that really results in is an EUI, somewhere in the 18 to 24 range. And this is a little scatter plot that you can see the average EUI. But of course, we're talking about lots of different building types in lots of different climates. So we are actually seeing zero energy being achieved at lots of different EUIs, but they tend to kind of to coalesce around these numbers. So as you're taking on projects, you can see that this gives you a rough idea of where to begin. And just for reference here, I talked about code just a moment ago. The 2018 IECC, Rhode Island is an IECC state, and you can see that delivers for, on average, an EUI somewhere around 50. So there is still a long way to go, even in new construction. And of course, we like to show and talk about what are the projects that are leading the way. And schools are really a big leader in zero energy. I talked about how multifamily is the fastest growth, but really it has been schools for quite a while now. And schools are the ones where we're seeing the greatest penetration in zero energy buildings. And that makes a lot of sense when you really think about it, because schools have budgets and they need to keep their operating costs under control, not just their construction costs. And so there's an automatic incentivization to think about what are going to be the life cycle costs of those buildings. So let's ask the question of why you might pursue a path to zero, because the energy is, of course, an obvious reason, but there are also a lot of non-energy benefits to high performance buildings. Now, this is that classic 330-300 breakdown, that if your energy costs are for a building, say an office building, are about $3 per square foot, then and your rent might be around $30 per square foot, but for a building that's in use, your salaries and your operations are going to be more like $300 per square foot. So we see energy, rent, and payroll. And so the energy use in the building, the energy cost in a building can really be dwarfed by what a business is paying the people who are in the building. And so you could reduce 100% of your energy costs, and that would only be equivalent to making a 1% savings in your payroll costs, which is one of the reasons that it makes a lot of sense to look at the non-energy benefits of high performance buildings, because they have impact not just on the energy costs, but they also have an impact on the people. This chart really takes a look at some of those economic impacts, looking beyond how just that energy and what energy efficiency does. And go ahead and take a look at it. It actually comes from where NBI is located, Oregon. There's a lot of information on this side, but the key takeaway here is that with an increase in energy efficiency adoption, we see more energy efficient products, lamps, panels. They're being produced, bought, and installed. And that has a real economic benefit to the locality. But we were talking about the payroll and that impact on the actual building itself. And in high performance buildings, we have seen not just reductions in energy, that green leaf, but we're also seeing improvements in occupant well-being, satisfaction, and if you're thinking about economics, most importantly, productivity. So there is a financial benefit. You can get more productivity out of those occupants and healthier and happier occupants, which can have a much larger economic impact on a building than just the energy savings. So this information is from the Better Places for People, Doing Right by the Planet and the People Guide, released in April of 2018. This is something that you might take a look at as you're looking to try to see what are those other benefits of high performance buildings. So how do those health benefits really shake out? With better ventilation rates, better temperature controls, better control of VOCs and CO2, you see lower absenteeism, better attention to detail, higher cognitive ability even, especially as CO2 levels are dropped down. And many studies have looked and seen that these impacts all affect, especially in office workers. And here we have another resource that you can look at, the health, well-being, and productivity of offices. And these are the sorts of things that they are identifying. Lower staff turnover. I think that one is actually a really big thing when you consider how much it takes just to get one of your employees up and going. And then also the satisfaction of the people in the spaces can also be increased. So we see that there is the benefit to the environment of going green, but that the companies can also save money by occupying green buildings. The employees generally prefer green buildings, and then even a building's asset value can increase the greener and the healthier it is. And this is one thing that we have seen consistently, and it's been studied in LEED buildings, that the actual valuation of buildings is impacted by whether or not it has these green certifications. So I mentioned schools before, how schools are leading the way. And so I'd like to talk just real briefly about schools and why you would want to go to zero energy in schools specifically. So there is the cost avoidance from utility bills to the classroom. So that is an ongoing cost savings to the school owner, usually the school district. It's a more comfortable and productive environment for teachers and students. So if you think about it, a school's job is to educate the students. And so this actually makes the school better able to do its job, to serve the purpose for which it was built. By building inefficient schools without the same kind of indoor environmental quality, we're actually building an asset that doesn't do what it's intended to do as well. But there are also other benefits, such as the fact that it provides a hands-on, tangible learning opportunity for 21st century schools. high performance, energy efficiency, the controls that are often in high performance schools. And it also makes communities stronger, more resilient and energy independent. And this is something that we are increasingly seeing is a focus on resiliency, especially in the spate of natural disasters that we've had over the last several years. They seem to be getting worse and worse. And schools are a natural center for, rallying point in an emergency. And the same factors that make a school a high performance school also make it better able to get back on its feet after a disaster and usable, whether that's because it has the kinds of features that let it operate without energy, or because it's a zero energy school that is ready to operate off grid after an emergency and be a source of energy in the community. So we've talked a little bit. I want to talks about some studies specifically in high performance schools for the non-energy benefits. So we've got a few things here that occupants and ventilated spaces with low CO2 and low volatile organic compounds, VOCs, had improved scores in crisis response, information usage, and strategy ranging from 100 to 300% improvement. Students in daylit environments showed a 20 to 26% improvement on test scores compared to traditionally lit environments. Students with operable windows progressed 7 to 8% faster than those without operable windows. Students with the most daylight performed 7 to 18% better in math and reading than those without. And students exposed to daylight attended school 3.2 to 3.8 more days per year. So for those of you who are my age, during the era when they were getting rid of windows in schools because they were quote unquote distracting, these schools that have view windows and access to daylight and access to views, these hallmarks of high performance schools, these are actually resulting in better test score performance out of students. And here are some great fast facts that you can use as if you are considering a schools project. And I just want to give you a moment to look at these, but I think that we see especially the 65% reduction in asthma cases among elementary students when school indoor environmental quality improves. That's one I do want to draw your attention to. Asthma is kind of an increasing epidemic in our population, and it's a major health issue with otherwise healthy people. And so by having healthy schools, we can actually have a real impact on the overall health of our childhood population. So we've talked about just zero energy in general and zero energy buildings and their characteristics, the other benefits. So how do you get there? And what we found by looking at buildings is that there are a lot of ways to get to zero energy buildings, but a few common strategies and technologies keep popping up. They keep being part of that successful mix. And what we're seeing is, stakeholder awareness, especially when you're dealing with public projects. A team selection that is really cognizant of making sure that that team has the right skills to get to zero. A good integrated design and pre-design process so that zero is integrated in the beginning, but also that we're bringing those energy concerns forward in the design process so that they can be effectively handled. And prioritization of buildings, if you're dealing with an entire building stock, selecting which buildings you're actually going to go after zero first, setting your goals and your targets, looking at the right financing and incentives, and understanding that you have both different needs for financing in zero energy, but also different opportunities, paying close attention to the design and construction, paying especially close attention to the project handoff, because only so much can be handled during the design phase. The building actually has to be transferred to the occupants and the operators, which leads, of course, directly into operations and maintenance to actually achieve those energy goals set in the design process. So using schools again as our example, we see that in different climate zones that there are different opportunities for setting those targets. It's important to set them early on. You can see that, regardless of climate zone, those EUI targets are actually pretty close together. There's not a big spread, and that's because a zero energy building really has to focus on the entire building performance and responding to its climate. Now, I wanted to take a moment to talk about existing buildings specifically, because building prioritization is one of the strategies that you heard me mention before. And that's, so if you are looking to get to deep energy savings in buildings, or even going all the way to zero in existing buildings, then you really have a process that you need to follow. You know, that starts with benchmarking, what Dilip was talking about. In Providence, they're looking at doing, you know, they're doing on a voluntary basis now, looking to make it required in the future. Well, that's an essential part, is you have to understand where the building's performance is. There are lots of useful tools out there. You can use just your energy bills that come from the local utility, and you can use the tools like Energy Star Portfolio Manager, you might as well get used to it now, or other online data tracking tools to see how the building is actually performing now. But if you want to see if this building is a good candidate for zero energy, it takes more than just understanding where it is. It takes an understanding of why it's where it is. And that really depends on investment and assessment. Looking at the building's characteristic, its physical characteristics. What is its envelope like? What is its structural system like? What is its electrical? Identify not just the weaknesses, but also the strengths in these existing systems. It takes looking at the site itself so that you can see if there are opportunities. You know, your climate actually is not just a negative, it can be a positive. Are there natural ventilation opportunities? Are there natural daylighting or passive solar opportunities? And of course, talking to the people who use the buildings themselves. You know, not just the facilities managers, but also, and the operators, but also the occupants themselves, so that you can understand how it's actually operating day to day. And when you're thinking about whether a building is a good candidate for going from where it is to zero energy, you know, I think that it makes a lot of sense to think about the way that a building exists. You know, this isn't a new building. We're not just starting from scratch. And so there are really opportunities in a building's life. You know, every building has a life cycle, and those life cycles provide opportunities to make energy efficiency improvements, including going all the way to zero energy. And that requires having a plan, you know, looking at, you know, are you just going to leave it as is? And sometimes that makes the most sense because the time isn't right. You can plan in place, so just making general improvements to it how it is, you know, so that just as the building goes through its natural life cycle, you can address things as they come up. Or you can take a more serious approach, that major renovation, where you make large scale changes all at once, and that provides a real opportunity to make significant changes. And I like to look at it this way. So, you know, you get that major renovation chance maybe every 30 to 50 years. But more often that you're going to get an HVAC replacement. That's going to happen every 15 to 20 years. And that's a major opportunity to make changes in the building. You know, your lighting retrofit might be every 5 to 7 years in an office. In an office, your lease renewal might be every 2 to 5 years. And that's another opportunity to make energy efficiency improvements. And of course, real estate transactions. And one of the reasons that real estate transactions make such an opportunity is because that's when money is involved. There's refinancing, there's mortgages. These kinds of transactions create an opportunity to bring capital in to make these improvements. And that could include, you know, smaller transactions, whether like the leases that we talked about before, or refinancing. And part of this, looking at these economics, is really with zero energy, what you're doing is you are taking the total life cycle costs of owning and operating a building, and you're kind of moving them forward. So, you know, the utility costs that you would have paid over time, well, you're avoiding some of that over time by building a better building up front. High performance buildings have been found to have lower maintenance costs and repair costs, so that ongoing maintenance and repair, you're avoiding some of that later on. All buildings need some maintenance at least, and by building a better value up front. And so if you can think of a zero energy building in terms of the net present value of all of these characteristics that you're creating in a building, that makes, any additional cost that there might be for going to high performance, it justifies it more. It makes it makes that incremental cost analysis work better. So we've talked about existing buildings and that assessment and thinking about how you get in there. And now we'd like to talk about how, all right, you're moving forward with your design process. And we mentioned early on that one of those strategies was the integrated design process. And there are formal integrated design processes out there, but really want to talk about it more generally, whether or not you're following one of those formal or not. That what you want to do is bring that expertise into the project early. And one great way to do that is with a zero energy design charrette. Here's another piece of guidance that's out there and available, the Getting to Zero Net Energy Integrated Design Charrette Toolkit. And what that charrette really does is it provides an opportunity, one, to educate everyone who's involved in this project and get them all on the same board, on the same page about, this is the goal for the project. This is what we're trying to achieve. And so as we go through all of this process, the decisions that we make really need to serve reaching this goal. And since zero energy buildings are often very integrated in systems, the systems are designed to work together really well. These charrettes also foster teamwork so that the team members can really work together on making sure that those pieces of integration really work. Of course, getting everyone to agree on the energy target and the sustainability goals, get everyone to buy in, and then to brainstorm the potential technologies and strategies to achieve the target. But one of the reasons you want to bring this team together early on is so that you can identify pitfalls that are oftentimes not identified until later. And again, what we have found is we have these common strategies and measures that keep popping up in our zero energy buildings that we're seeing hit the market. We're seeing passive measures in them, so daylighting, natural ventilation, even using passive heating and cooling. We're seeing high performance envelopes with both good thermal performance and air tightness. We're seeing high performance space conditioning. We're often seeing that separate. So the space conditioning and ventilation being handled by different systems, high performance interior lighting, high performance hot water distribution, not just equipment. One of the really big things is plug load management, of course the on-site renewable energy, but we're also seeing the integration of things like electric vehicle charging and battery storage in these buildings. So let's talk about passive first. So this is the Provincetown Art Association and Museum from, not that too far from you guys, different Provincetown. And this used two passive strategies. One was having a very efficient envelope. So that envelope is always going to be performing really well, regardless of what the active systems are doing, but also providing daylighting. And this is in an art environment. So, oftentimes there's the excuse that, oh, we can't have daylighting, it's bad for whatever is in the room. Well, this is a museum. You can do daylighting even when the objects in the room are sensitive. But so when we look at passive first, we're really talking about a high performance envelope, and that includes things like window to wall ratio, the thermal performance of the materials themselves. So that's both insulation and windows. Taking care of infiltration and reducing infiltration levels, which is also key to indoor environmental quality. And then also addressing something that is often under-addressed, which is thermal bridges, these high conductive materials that pass through the envelope that kind of act as a shortcut for heat to get in and out of the buildings. But it can also mean more sophisticated approaches like passive ventilation, looking at the opportunities for cross ventilation, which is where air moves across the space, or stack ventilation, where cool air comes in low, and as it heats, it exits high. I think one of the big ones is really night flushing, because that is a real opportunity to cool down buildings before the day even starts. And these can be integrated with active systems so that you don't have to go all the way to natural ventilation all the time. Looking at your shading opportunities, so to reduce the amount of solar gains that get in to reflect the light around so that you're just getting the day lighting and you're not getting as much of those solar gains through the windows that you have. That's kind of always the mixed bag about windows, is that yes, you let in the light and you've got daylighting, but you're also letting the heat in and out of the buildings. And daylighting is really a big one, and that's one that should be part of every high performance building. Designing your windows so that they effectively bring lighting into buildings. And even now, even with higher efficiency lighting technologies, lighting is still a major use, especially in office environments. And of course, daylighting allows you to reduce or eliminate the electric lighting that you use in the space. But at the same time, you have to be cognizant that a good daylighting design is going to have impact on the spaces and how they're laid out. It's going to mean less walls. You may not have those private offices all around the perimeter of your office building, and it has to be controlled. Lots of windows doesn't mean that you have a daylit building. A daylit building has carefully selected windows that let in enough light, but don't let in too much light so that you don't get glare, but also let in light in a way that penetrates the building as deeply as possible, using things like light shelves, exterior shades, and interior shades. And of course, even surface color and texture has an impact on daylighting. So having highly effective daylighting systems can have an impact on the aesthetics that you choose for the building. So moving beyond passive, we talked about interior lighting, and we're really to the point now where LED is the way to go. The color quality is there. They can look like standard light fixtures, and they also provide some interesting opportunities to design atypical lighting, which that can be a benefit in and of itself. But it's important to not just select efficient lighting, you need to control that lighting well. So that daylighting, that only saves energy if the electric lights get turned off. And so you need to have effective controls for daylighting, automatic occupancy and vacancy controls to turn lights off, but also good manual controls so that when your users are interacting with the buildings, the lights are easy to control and it's easy to understand the controls, and they actually have control over their space so that you don't just have one switch that turns the whole floor on and off. We had talked about the building envelope. Want to dig a little bit more into that because the envelope is the key to making zero energy work in those, especially in those more extreme climates. And we wanted to really narrow in on air sealing and infiltration, because that's an area that is often neglected, and it's one that the codes haven't done as much on the commercial side. Testing is an option for the air barrier in the commercial energy code, but it's not required like it is in most residential codes. But it's really important to bring that infiltration rate down, because every bit of conditioned air that you lose through your envelope that's air that you have to condition all over again. And it's not like it's actually providing good ventilation, because it's passing through the building envelope, and that's not an effective ventilation strategy. So you want to design around effective R values, of course, but really focus in on that air sealing. Do the testing as much as possible. And there are strategies for testing larger buildings, whether you isolate just a floor at a time or a space at a time. And then really pay a lot of attention to the air barrier and where those penetrations and joints go, so that you can minimize leakage, so that you can reduce the temperature changes and control that outdoor air. And, reduce things like mullions in your glass. That's, one of the ways that you get a higher performing glass fenestration system. But of course, the other part of that is the space conditioning. You really have to look at high efficiency systems, but more than just high efficiency systems, what the system is rated at is of course really important, but there are some system types that are just more efficient than others. And so look at selecting those types like VRF, like high performance multi and mini split systems, like ground source heat pumps, like radiant systems. These systems are frequently found in zero energy buildings because they are more effective at conditioning the space for the amount of energy than other systems, even when they have the same efficiency rating. But then, looking beyond just the space conditioning and looking at ventilation and the opportunities to do heat recovery. Of course, air tightness is a part of this, because part of sizing your HVAC system is accounting for the loss through infiltration. If you have VAV, looking at AC just for dehumidification. And then, of course, the impact of things like data centers and plug loads and lighting, because if you can actually bring those down, you can bring down your space conditioning loads as well. But one of the things that we're seeing in a lot of these buildings is high performance ventilation. Now, one of the really big examples of this is decoupling ventilation and space conditioning. So a dedicated outdoor air system can provide the ventilation all on its own. Most HVAC systems that are sized for space conditioning are oversized for ventilation. And so when they're only providing ventilation, they're actually doing it very inefficiently. And so there's the opportunity to decouple the two so that you can have ventilation being very efficiently provided, separate from the space conditioning system. And of course, this is a natural link with approaches like VRF that we talked about, or what you see here, the radiant heating and cooling, which is a great application of DOAS, where the radiant panels are very easy way to get radiant heating and cooling into a space. They can improve thermal comfort, and they're really well suited for mild climates, but they also work in more extreme climates as well. Now, looking beyond space conditioning, there's the other kind of equipment, which is your hot water production. Now, in a lot of commercial buildings, this is usually either a very small load or a very large load, because there's a big process load or because it's a multifamily building. And so what we're seeing is, the federal requirements for water heating is actually really lagging behind the best in class that's available on the market. So here we see an example of some individual gas and electric and central electric and central gas equipment. And that top row is the federal minimums, and the uniform energy factor is the new rating system that is just emerging on the market. And you can see how far Energy Star is beyond these code minimum that's set at the federal level. But even the best in class goes quite a bit beyond that. So there's big advances that can be made. And of course, this is a great example of where your local utility, and this is something that I want to highlight in general, is that your local utility, this is an example of National Grid, can really help with these sorts of technologies and getting them into your building. So not just for water heaters, but on all kinds of equipment that goes into the building, and even technical assistance. And we talked a little bit about controls and about how important it is for it to be very user-friendly, very intuitive. But we also have to have that local control, and you need to have the consistency. The usability of controls is one of the most important things. And that can be achieved at a very high level with sophisticated building automated systems, BAS systems, EMS systems that can really tightly integrate everything. And when you have a larger building, that can be a really effective way to make sure that all of the systems are working well together. But controls go beyond just the equipment. That is also an important way to address plug loads. As we bring down all of those other loads in a building, plug loads are becoming larger and larger, so that in a lot of zero energy buildings, plug loads can be as much as 50% of the total energy use. And so there are opportunities to bring down those loads through actually controlling the receptacles that the plug loads, non-essential plug loads, are plugged into. And there is also the opportunity through equipment selection and policies and the ongoing operations of the building to bring down the amount of loads that are brought into the building to start with. So that's one of those important things about bridging to operations. Plug loads are one of the most essential places where that needs to happen. Which gets us to, kind of operations in general, that you need to have a feedback mechanism to the operators and the occupants so that they can see how the building's doing and see the impacts of their behaviors, so that they can make adjustments, so that you can foster a little bit of competition and goal seeking. And that feedback to the occupants is a really important part of getting to zero. So I wanted to talk about just briefly this idea of the impact of consumption to the renewable production. And here is a school design where they were looking at different ways to put the school together and how that impacted consumption, and therefore how that would impact how much renewables they had to put on it. And so by saving energy in the design, they were also saving cost in the size of the PV system that they would have to put on the building to achieve zero energy. So this is why you really have to look at the energy efficiency side first before you get, and PV is sexy, everyone's got their focus on renewable energy, but really the efficiency comes first. And there are lots of ways that you can estimate how much energy you can get out of your site and out of your roof. And here's just one tool, NREL's PV watts calculator. And it's important to understand how much renewable energy you can actually generate on site. So really this comes down to taking a strategic approach. You have to have that goal clear from the very beginning, and you have to go through all of these considerations. Consider the comfort and health. Consider your life cycle opportunities. Use your energy modeling as a design tool, not just a specification tool. Really begin with load reduction and then optimize all of your mechanical systems. So load reduction through passive strategies, and then optimize all of your active systems like space conditioning, ventilation, lighting, hot water, and then you get to those PVs at the end. There are a lot of resources out there available, a lot of them put out by NBI, but also by other sources. So look at those sources that are available out there. You're not bushwhackers here. You don't have to carve the path for yourself. There are a lot of places that you can look for guidance on how to achieve these goals. And there are a lot of examples of other people who have done it. So we have case studies available online for you to look at. You can follow that well-trod path that others have walked before you. There's a registry and a database that you can look at other buildings and begin to see how they got to zero energy so that you can get there too. So that ends my part. We've got some time left for questions, especially if you thought of any questions as I was talking that you wanted to ask Dilip. Now is a good time for that as well. So Connie, have you had any questions come through? And anyone else who has questions, just please go ahead and type them into that chat pane.
I have not gotten any questions outside of whether people were going to receive copies of the slides. And indeed, we'll be sending out an email tomorrow about this time with a link to both the presentation and the recording that can be viewed on demand. Let's see. Okay, we got one question. What have you been seeing in the healthcare sector as far as progress in Z&E?
So healthcare is one of those tougher nuts to crack because it has that higher intensity. But, one of the things that we are seeing is a lot more effective management of those plug loads. Healthcare is one of those areas where plug load control is really important. I mean, you have to have that equipment ready to go, but it's not being used a lot of the time. And you have a lot of spaces that are controlled for the optimal use. So, this is one, and I'm trying to think of any examples of buildings that have gotten all the way there, and I'm not sure that we have any quite yet. I'd have to actually look at our status update. But a lot of the strategies that we're talking about here do apply well to healthcare, and especially the high performance systems I think are key for healthcare spaces, because if it's got to be on all the time or it has to be ready all the time, then you really need to make sure that it's as efficient as possible.
Okay, let's see here. Please elaborate on strategies and best practices for achieving zero energy in existing multifamily buildings.
So existing multifamily buildings there's kind of an interesting simultaneous barrier and opportunity, which is that you have all these individual units. And having all these individual units are kind of a barrier because it means that's a lot of individual tenants that you have to deal with if you want to make large scale changes to a multifamily building. But in a lot of multifamily buildings, each one of those units is fairly self-contained. And so there's also, that provides an opportunity to do it one at a time. Now, that doesn't work for everything that you might do, but it can work for a lot of things. And so you can replace the lighting, replace the space conditioning, address ventilation. And this is a really critical thing, is in this country, we have had very poor ventilation of our multifamily units. And so bringing in effective, efficient ventilation is a critical thing. And that can be done during tenant turnover. You know, you can even address envelope issues, like you can do window replacements if it's a punch opening window. You can even do air tightness improvements, because what we're increasingly seeing is that in multifamily, there are a lot of benefits to tightening the units themselves and not just the building as a whole, so that you get less odor between buildings and better indoor air quality. And so all of those things can be addressed on a unit by unit basis. Now, sometimes it's not going to be possible though. And so you might have to think of a way that you can move tenants around or even vacate a building so that you can do something that's more large scale. But you know, existing multifamily, that barrier that we have traditionally seen, you know, that can be turned into an opportunity as well, and it's certainly possible.
Okay, another question. How can I assess achievement of ZE results in operations as it relates to indoor air quality? For example, did I lose indoor air quality as I reached for ZE?
So this is, I know, and I brought this up with multifamily as well, but you know, indoor air quality really requires effective ventilation. That means that you can't count on air coming through your envelope. And one of the big misnomers out there is that, oh, I'm using more energy for ventilation because I've got this super tight building, and so now I have to add energy when to do the ventilation because I've tightened up my building. But the reality is that loose building was not providing effective ventilation before and was not providing good indoor air quality. And so you have to think of that ventilation issue of introducing mechanical ventilation to provide effective ventilation as a somewhat separate issue. We need the mechanical ventilation even on the loose building, because the loose building wasn't effectively ventilated. And once you have mechanical ventilation, what do you need to do it efficiently? So tightening up a building does not reduce indoor air quality. It's if you didn't have effective ventilation before the building was tight, you know, after the building was tight, there's probably a good chance that you didn't have it before it was tight either. So it really is about bringing in those effective strategies for ventilation so that you only ventilate as much as you need, because, you know, uncontrolled movement through the envelope is also a bad thing for both indoor environmental quality and for energy efficiency.
Okay, I think that was the last question today. Looks like it. Are you ready to close out, Sean?
I'm ready.
All right. Well, thanks everybody for participating, and we will get these slides and the link to the recording out to you tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you everyone for joining us today.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Sean and Connie.